Keaton Fletcher, an assistant professor of industrial organizational psychology at Colorado State University.
And I'm Mariana Arvon, an organizational psychologist who specializes in organization and talent development.
And this is Healthy Work. All right, welcome back to another episode of Healthy Work. I'm so excited to be joined by two amazing guests today, and I will go ahead and get out of the way and let them introduce themselves.
Yeah, so my name is Dr. Ian Hughes. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Texas A&M University. And generally, I like to study things related to occupational health.
And I'm Andrea Bazzoli. Currently, I'm in the Department of Psychology at Baruch College and the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City. I'm also in occupational health psychology, and financial stress and safety are two of the main topics I research, along with more quantitative methods.
Very cool. And that leads us really well into discussing the paper that you recently published in the Journal of Business and Psychology. Do you want to give us a quick overview of what it was that you did and what you found?
Sure. Basically, the main idea behind this study was to look at how financial stress, that is, worries about someone's financial situation. Think about the money you make, but also you have financial commitments. Think about like paying rent, or if you own a house, you gotta pay mortgage likely. Or if you have a credit card, you gotta pay that at the end of each month. Or adult financial commitments like buying groceries. The idea of financial stress is that there is stress that develops when your financial resources are perceived to not be enough to cover all of your expenses. And we really wanted to look at how financial stress fluctuates over time, right? It's not like the idea, as our paper suggests, money comes and goes, right? Our bank accounts, we receive money when we work, we receive a paycheck, but also money goes out. And really what we're looking at is how it fluctuates, and also whether we can predict what impacts those perceptions of financial stress.
And I'll add on to that just by providing a little context. So it's no secret that Americans are worried about money in the economy. It's been that way for a few years now. And so we opened our paper by kind of contextualizing financial stress alongside other things. So there's research out there that shows that, it's harder for a lot of people to talk about money than it is to talk about things like politics or death even. And so financial stress is something that everybody is kind of like acutely or innately familiar with, rather. But the assumption in the prior literature is that, as financial stress, or rather financial obligations increase, financial stress is thought to increase too. So for instance, if I have, let's say, 4 sources or 5 sources of debt, I'm going to have less financial stress than somebody who has, let's say, 7 or 8. And so we were really just interested in seeing, and we had a little bit of a hunch that maybe wasn't really the way that things were unfolding. And so the purpose of our paper was really just to go out there and explore, let the data sort of tell us, okay, we looked at a bunch of different financial predictors, things like sources of debt. We looked at overspending. We looked at savings. We looked at getting paid. So like, were you paid this week or were you not? So we assessed a lot of fairly common financial indicators. And really, we just said, okay, well, we have a hunch that financial stress doesn't unfold in a linear fashion. It's not that the more financial, again, maybe as an example, the more sources of debt I have, the more financial stress I have. Well, that's not entirely true, because there's also the likelihood that the more sources of debt you have, the more money that you have as well. So really, we just wanted to go in and see, one, how does financial stress, as Andrea said, unfold over time? And two, all of these various indicators of financial behavior, how do they contribute to financial stress, not only over time, but do they do so in a linear fashion? And what we found is that the answer is that no, it does not unfold. Financial stress is very much a fluctuating construct over time, and we'll go into it a little bit more, I'm sure. But a lot of these financial predictors are related to financial stress, not in a linear way, but in a nonlinear way.
How interesting. It makes me think of when I was in graduate school, the pay structure changed a couple of times depending on whether or not I was on a grant or was working as a teaching assistant. Regardless, I was dirt poor. But when I was a teaching assistant, I was getting paid like every 2 weeks. And it felt in some ways a little bit more manageable, even though my bills hadn't really changed. I could just plan better. But then at other points, when I was on this one grant, it would pay over the summer in one big lump sum, and it would slowly trickle down over the summer. And then my credit card bills would start like slowly increasing over the course of the rest of the summer until I started getting paid again during the fall. And yeah, like the idea of it not being a linear trajectory, both with sources of debt and income, because like those obviously didn't change, but like how that was coming in changed. And the outcome of it, like I felt much more stressed under that like lump sum format where I could see my debt just like slowly increasing. I could see the interest payments slowly increasing, where it wasn't that way when I was getting paid biweekly, even though the amount I was making didn't change. So yeah, I mean, you said that there's more detail in what you all found, and I'd love to hear a little bit more.
Sure. So we really, as Ian mentioned, we took a hybrid approach. We had some ideas of how those effects might pan out, but then really we let the data speak without imposing any sort of structure, like linear, quadratic, cubic. But really, what we found and what perhaps surprised us a little bit is the effect of small amount of money, like small changes in, say, how much someone brings in for that paycheck, or if they overspent a little bit more than their usual. Those, what we estimated is like it was very few $100s, like $200 to $300. Those small sums of money that really have a large effect on perceptions of financial stress that we weren't expecting. We're like, oh yeah, right. So if think about if someone gives you $10,000 more this paycheck for some reason, perhaps is like a bonus, or like for any reason you get a lot more than what you usually get. We're like, yeah, that should have a huge effect, right? Because now you have a huge chunk of money that you didn't have before. What we found though is that it's not quite the entire story. Like small amount of money in the order of like a couple $100 really have a large effect on perceptions of financial stress, both in terms of like making a few $100s more than usual and spending and overspending, right? So like spending more than what you made that like 2 week or like 1 week framework.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, especially when you are not a billionaire, those small fluctuations mean so much. I remember just feeling like I was going to be financially ruined when I had to buy new tires for a car, right? Or feeling like I was finally financially stable when I was able to take an internship and get an extra couple $100s a month, even though, like, really, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that big of a difference in the moment when you are budgeting paycheck to paycheck and not quite making it every time. Those really small fluctuations can make a big difference. And it makes me think of like macroeconomic type stuff that we don't frequently talk about in our field, which is one of the reasons I really am excited about and love your paper, where we think about like policies like universal basic income that some cities have tried out, where it's like $500 payments to people that, seem like not a lot on paper. Budget wise, it's not huge, but it makes a really big difference to the people who receive those. And I think there's some research out there that shows it's like mostly spent on basic necessities like groceries and maybe a little bit of paying down debt that's already been accrued. And then thinking about like how we design like our tax structures where a tax bill at the end of the year for an extra $500 or so when you are at the lowest income bracket looks a lot different than a tax bill for $500,000 when you're in the top bracket. And so like what are the implications there? And I know that's stepping very far beyond your paper, but it just feels like the natural progression and something that we can talk about is a field more broadly, and like what is the intersection with work. And
I think it's super interesting, honestly. I mean, at this point, we're speculating because it's way beyond what we were able to look at in a paper. But definitely, right, looking at and incorporating like economic fluctuations and how, financial behaviors do shape behaviors at work and also outside of work, right? Because money is all around us. It's the main type of resource. So really, I think the field and IO and other fields as well are long overdue for looking at economics and how macroeconomic events shape employee behaviors.
So I just wanted to jump in really quickly to comment on your point, Keaton, about like broader macro level things like tax policy or other kinds of financial policy and what have you. I did want to note that we did collect our data. We collected data over the course of 9 weeks, and that 9 week period was starting in early January of 2024 and went until right around mid March of 2024, which is the time period where a lot of people are receiving their end of year bonuses. There are people who are getting their tax returns back if they're eager and file early, which I need to do more. Yeah, so it is a little bit speculative to kind of like think about, policy changes and whatnot as it relates to our paper, but it is something that the time period of the data collection did allow us to make a little bit of speculations about, for instance, structuring bonuses, depending, of course, on a worker's financial situation. Instead of providing a large lump sum, we recommended that year-end bonuses could be split into 2 or 3 smaller payments. The same amount, of course, would be distributed, but maybe we could structure that bonus differently as a way of alleviating folks' financial stress. Just because, as Andrea mentioned, what we found in our article was that relative to one's usual payment amount, so every month, everybody kind of has an idea for how much they're going to be spending on their, let's say, car payments, other loan payments, student loan debt, credit card payments, medical obligations, what have you. There's kind of a psychological, I guess, there's an amount that people are expecting to pay. What we found was that the fluctuations in financial stress, both, spikes in financial stress as well as dips in financial stress, primarily occurred like plus or minus $500 around that average amount. And so, yeah, just to really kind of emphasize what Andrea is saying, it isn't the large sums of money necessarily that seemed to have the most impact in our manuscript. It was actually the smaller amounts relative to what people are used to paying, of course.
Piggybacking on what Ian just said, I think our paper, although not directly, really there's other evidence. I think over 10 years ago, I think 2014, in Chicago, the city of Chicago, along with other academic partners, they tried and they split the earned income tax credit. That is, usually it helps low to moderate income workers and families to get a tax break, right? If you don't make a lot of money, you potentially may qualify for the earned income tax credit. Or what it is, how it is disbursed, is one lump sum. The city of Chicago, like, what happens if we do periodic payments instead of one lump sum? And the results, their findings were in line with our findings, though they weren't able to randomize. So, like, the ability to draw causal claims is limited because they let participants pick whether they wanted one lump sum or periodic payment. But I think the evidence is accumulating, even though like one paper can't by itself just show that it works. The evidence is accumulating in that direction.
That makes so much sense to me, especially because of the way that our society is structured, where like if you did have an expense come up that you weren't planning on, and you won't be able to pay that off until you get your bonus a year from now or your tax credit a year from now. You still have to pay it, but now you're accruing debt and interest on that payment, right? Through access to credit cards or private loans or whatever. And so like that's even more stressful. But if you can spread those payments out across, a wider timeline, now you have a bit more of a cushion to be able to address those financial stressors that are unplanned and unexpected, or maybe to create a bit of a psychological safety net where you have this tiny nest egg and you don't have to like wait 11 months to get a big payment that you now have to pay a lot towards interest when it arises or something along those lines. It also makes me think of, and again, stepping very far past your paper, back when we had those COVID payments in the US of like $1,500, certainly not enough to make people like to replace their income. But I think that we can tie that, at least to some degree, to the sort of like power that labor had and the renewed interest in unions and the invigorated sense of like quiet quitting, along with a bunch of other like macro level stuff. But I think just like even a small payment where you're like, oh, I feel a bit more financially stable, a little less financially stressed than I did last week or last month might have, I don't know, again, stretching, but I think that there's something there about like labor feeling like they had more power because they had just a tiny bit amount more money than they did 2 weeks before that they weren't necessarily planning on. I know that we've danced around the answer to this question a couple of times, but like, if you could put a point on it, what would your advice to either workers or managers be based on this paper?
So our main implication for workers and managers is really to pay attention to this like flow of money in and out. And especially one implication that we point out in the paper is about the Secure Act 2.0 was signed in end of 2022 by then President Biden. And among other provisions of that act, and the intention here is to enhance retirement savings and financial security for Americans, right? There's so much evidence out there showing that Americans, on average, don't have enough money for retirement. And this act really tried to redress, at least in part, this issue, right? Because if you don't have enough money saved, you won't be able to retire, say, when you are age 65 or 67. But one of the provisions in this act is the automatic enrollment in 401k and 403b plans, which is great, right? We want to encourage workers to save money for retirement. And a good way is to automatically enroll them in 401k and 403b plans. So this is great, right? The goal is great to have people save money for retirement. But this money comes from their paycheck, right? So they might be expecting to make a certain amount of money, and then they are automatically enrolled in saving plans that reduces the amount of money they see and they take home, right? And this only applies for newer plans that were established after the act was signed in late 2022. But if you are, especially if you're working for a like newer firm or corporation, it is likely that they have a newer plan that wasn't established before the end of 2022, and you might be automatically enrolled in those plans, which is great again. But I think managing this, really making slightly more or like slightly less than your usual, that's what the message that our paper makes is we should really pay a lot more attention than we currently are on how public policy and economics affect workplace and behaviors of workers when they work and when they also are outside of work.
I'll throw in here real quick that there's a method to the money madness, essentially, is what our paper suggests. And so, organizations inherently have an interest in reducing financial stress in their workforce. It's perhaps not very surprising that when we look at, just overall aggregate trends and what have you, that people who are experiencing higher levels of financial stress are also reporting more strains. So things like burnout, things like, differences in mental health outcomes for people who have greater financial stress than not. And so organizations do have an inherent interest in alleviating some of the stress in their workforce. And what our paper, I think, really importantly suggests is that you can't just throw large sums of money at your workers and expect that to be a long-term solution. Certainly, it might be a solution in the short term. Our paper does take a longer term approach. And so, it's obviously going to be cool to receive a large sum of money all at once. But if you're interested in alleviating the effects of financial stress in your workforce over time, there's going to have to be some sort of targeted strategy or intervention, just because pretty much all of these relationships were nonlinear. So it's not as if having more financial resources means I have less stress. That's not exactly what we found. And then one other thing I'll add is that, again, just small money fluctuations are really important. I'm hesitant to overemphasize the role of personal responsibility when it comes to economics, given that we're all living in a society that has its own rules and laws, and those change all the time. But what I will say is that we do note in our paper that it might be enticing for certain workers to, for instance, when they're in a pinch, rely on things like buy now, pay later services like Klarna and what have you. But given that smaller money fluctuations were really what we found to be the most predictive of financial stress, those might actually end up being more harmful over time than maybe some other bigger things like loans and what have you. Again, extrapolating a little bit further out than our paper would explicitly suggest. But smaller money fluctuations just overall, regardless of the way we sort of framed those fluctuations, whether it's overspending or saving or what have you, those seem to be doing the most legwork in terms of impacting financial stress.
So cool. And I love these insights. And, we've alluded to it a couple of times in a couple of different ways, but I am curious, as you did this, what surprised you?
So, Andrea being a stats wizard, we did some cool data analytic techniques and whatnot. But I think to me, the most interesting part of our paper was simply the nonlinear, just aggregate relationship between income and financial stress. There's a lot of old sayings in society, money can't buy happiness, so on and so forth. And so our paper kind of does give a little bit of insight into that. So what we found is that there really wasn't a huge discrepancy between the amount of financial stress reported between those who had, let's say, an income of 100,000 a year and those who had an income of 125 to 150,000 a year. In fact, their financial stress levels were almost identical. The trajectory of financial stress, perhaps unsurprisingly, people who make between 50 and 100,000, there's a pretty steep reduction in financial stress for those folks. But once you make 100 grand, you really have to make like another 100 to 150,000 to see another pretty sizable reduction in financial stress. And so I think it just kind of goes to show you that financial stress it's not just simply having more means you're better off. There's a lot of other factors to consider here as well.
Yeah, as a financial stress scholar, really, I thought I knew how financial stress would be impacted by these financial behaviors. Turns out that a lot of things that I thought was like, yeah, this makes sense in light of previous literature or our theories. It's not as easy. Really, I was like, this is in my wheelhouse. I do financial stress research for a living. So those fluctuations, or like the fact that all of our relationships were nonlinear in different ways, right? 'Cause if you look at our paper, the relationship between financial stress and annual income is generally negative, as we would expect, but definitely not linear, as Ian just mentioned. And all of the other relationships as well, they're very much nonlinear. There's a lot of the fluctuations that we usually, as scholars, right, we would use to think about, oh, A is linearly associated with B, but maybe that is, at least for financial stress, doesn't seem to be the case.
So interesting. And, if anyone wants to experimentally test this by giving out payments, I volunteer. I will be a subject, I promise. Doesn't matter the amount, but I'm here.
Me
You know,
too, me too.
Yeah, sign me up as well.
all right. Well, my final question for you, it's my favorite question. Why do you do this work? Andrea, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm a financial stress scholar. So really, I wanted to get this work done with Ian. And my motivation was really like looking at my own experiences with money. I graduated from grad school in 2023, so it's just like it's been a few years where I have a meaningful paycheck, right, beyond being a graduate student. And I was looking at like my own financial behavior, like, oh, now I actually make a decent paycheck and I can afford things. I can just like splurge a little bit on a few things. So it really was motivated by like in part my own experience transitioning from being a graduate student to being a full-time faculty member with a salary. That really what motivated me in getting more into how these dynamics and how money goes in and out. That's really what motivated me.
Unlike Andrea, I am not a financial stress scholar by trade. I primarily research things related to helping behavior and mistreatment at work. But to kind of piggyback off of what Andrea said, first and foremost, I graduated in 2023 as well. It's only been a few years with a adult paycheck, and in those few years, I have become acutely familiar with financial stress and how harmful it can be. And so we wanted to provide actionable solutions for organizations. And to do that, we reviewed the literature, and a lot of literature on financial stress was not done over time. So time was not factored into a lot of prior work as sort of a natural condition through which financial stress might impact people. And so why I got really juiced up about this work in particular is that I felt like given the longer time frame that we had to work with, given our data set, we really could try and make some actionable recommendations for organizations that do help with some more of these targeted interventions. So again, I would say if there's like one major takeaway from our paper, it really is that these relationships are not linear. They are very complex. You can't just throw money at a financial stress problem and just expect it to go away in your workforce. And so our hope is that hopefully practitioners can get a few actionable like interventions out of our work that show that time is a factor to be considered. And that, again, a lot of these smaller money movements are really what are doing some of the heavy lifting as it pertains to alleviating financial stress.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for doing such great work and for your time. And I'll see you soon.
Yeah, thank you very much. We'll see you soon.
Thank you for having us, Kieran. Goodbye.
Healthy Work is a podcast written and executive produced by Keaton Fletcher and Mariana Arvon. This episode is produced, mixed, and edited by Keaton Fletcher. Artwork is by Keaton Fletcher. And our music is Zero, Microsong by Steve Combs. Please like us, follow us, and subscribe on whatever podcasting software you use. And please leave a review on the iTunes Store. It really does help get us out there.